Good afternoon. So today we're going to be talking about two things that are less commonly talked about and where we have a lot of new areas of research. The first on syntactical skills is going to be light, easy, like a little warm up to get you back in gear after lunch. And then we're going to spend more time talking about reading fluency for adolescents, and that'll be a bit of a deeper dive than we're doing for syntactical skills. Sound good so far? Okay. So this was working a moment ago. Hold on. There we go. So we're not going to talk about this today, but I will reference it several times in case you want to go ahead and grab the document through the QR code. This is a recently released IES practice guide on reading interventions for students in grades 4 through 9, as the title suggests. I had the pleasure of serving on the panel for this. There are 4 main recommendations that resulted from the review of the literature, and I'll be referencing which recommendation applies to what we're talking about as we go today. But here's what I will say. IES practice guides, as well as meta-analyses and other systematic reviews of the literature, are excellent at putting together all of the research that has been done up to the point of conducting that review. So they give you the full history, the accumulation of evidence up to that point. But the science of reading is a dynamic body of literature that is ever growing and that I and my colleagues continue to contribute to on a daily basis. So what we will be talking about today are new things that were not reviewed in the IES practice guide because they're occurring right now and didn't occur previously up to the point that we did this review in 2022. So I will reference things from which we drew in the IES practice guide that connect to these new lines of research, but I will be very upfront throughout that these are new lines of research and the evidence is just now coming through as we continue our studies. So again, our 2 components today are syntactic skills. Is there any way that we can hide this little, it's not on my computer, it's up here, but I worry it's gonna, is it bothering anyone else or is it just me that it's bothering? How do we make it go away? There. Improvise and overcome, right? Okay, so syntactic skills, again, we're going to have a little light, quick and easy to use strategy that you can leave here today and go back and hopefully implement with students that you work with as one approach. And then a little bit deeper dive into, I'll be more specific here, non-repetitive fluency practice, and I'll tell you why that is. So syntactic skills have to do with word level issues, not decoding, sentence level issues, not decoding, which are word level issues. We're talking about how we put all these words together to arrange them into sentences. So we step up to the sentence level when we're talking about syntactic skills. And those skills will relate, your ability with those skills will relate as we address it today to recommendation 3D in the IES practice guide, which has to do with helping students monitor their own comprehension during reading. So the strategy that we're going to talk about will help them be aware of when comprehension is broken down and give them a quick and easy thing they might do as one attempt to fix. It might not fix all of their issues with comprehension, but it's another thing that they can try. Recommendation 4 also connects to what we will be talking about today because what we want is lots of exposure to different syntactical constructions, different kinds of sentences, different ways of putting words together. So the more we attend to syntactical skills with students, the more we facilitate their ability to gain from this exposure to a wide range of texts. And all of that exposure to a wide range of texts gives them additional opportunities to see and experience these different syntactical structures. So some of the work that we're doing right now, a colleague of mine, Michael Orozco, and I have data on Spanish-English bilingual students. And so we followed a cohort of students and tested them over 3 years in word reading skills and in syntactical skills. We tested those skills in English, and then we used them to predict how they support comprehension in Spanish because they are bilingual, Spanish-English bilingual students. So looking at English skills, predicting Spanish comprehension. Year 1 was when the children were in grades 1, 2, and 3. Year 2, 2, 3, and 4. Year 3, they were in grades 3, 4, and 5. So you can see the blue bars here are word knowledge, starts out higher than syntactical skills, but not exceedingly higher. But by the second year, that had shifted. And by the third year, look at how syntactical skills are relative to word reading skills in predicting Spanish comprehension. So you can imagine as students continue that the importance of their syntactical knowledge will continue to contribute pretty significantly to their comprehension. So that's one example of how we're exploring syntactical skills as students progress in their reading abilities and with the different kinds of populations for whom syntactical skills can be really challenging. So Spanish and English have some similar structures and some different structures. So it's important that we address both of those with students who are not monolingual English. So all of these skills are syntactical skills that might be addressed. Something that is more commonly addressed is probably with grammatical morphemes. We typically think of morphemes, which are the smallest units of meaning within a word, as having to do with definitions of words. But morphemes also signal syntax because they tell you the part of speech of the word. They're also involved in creating possessives. So there are grammatical components that we consider within the study of morphology that can support students' syntactical skills. How we order words, how we combine sentences, how we do things like subject-verb agreement, those are all important things. We're going to be talking today about anaphoric and cataphoric references. So this is very similar to pronoun antecedent agreement. It's involved with that. Anaphoric means you go back, you're reading along, you encounter something, and you have to go back and see what was it that is referencing. Cataphoric means we go forward, so we start with the thing, and then we look forward and see how else is it referred to within the text. So that's what we're going to focus on for our light and easy breezy little strategy that we're going to do quick, and then move on to fluency. So our strategy, again, really quick strategy. The first thing we're going to do with a segment of text is find in a sentence what the main who or what or topic of that segment of text is. So if you're familiar with Get the Gist, it's that same approach. Find the most important who or what about this text. We're going to highlight that. And then we're going to look for all the other ways that that who or what is referred to, or the different words that are used to identify it in the next sentences. So we're going to start with an early one, and we're going to go forward. So that's cataphoric. As a reader, when I'm reading along, I would come to one of these other ways to refer to that who or what, and then I would go anaphorically. I'd look back and see what was it that it was referencing. But this part of the strategy, we're going to find it first and go forward and find the other ways that it's being referenced. And we will draw lines from what we highlighted as the most important who or what to the next way that it's referenced in that text. So I'm going to take this short text. I'm going to stretch it out a little bit so I can draw my lines more easily on this slide. And when I read this text, I identify as the most important topic of this short text is that we use multiple words to describe. So that's my thing. Now I'm going to look for all the other ways that that might be referenced within this short text. So as I read, because it's short, I only have one other sentence. I see one example here of this. So you can imagine if you're a student who isn't fluent in English, or you're an adolescent who has difficulty reading, you see this whole big thing, use multiple words to describe, and then the very next sentence they say this, and I have to stop and think, what was this? What does it go back to? So then I'm doing it anaphorically. Right now for my strategy, I'm trying to look forward and see how else will it be referenced within this text. I also see a little bit later, it. So it's not even called exactly the same thing, in the 2 times that it is then referenced within just 2 sentences of text. The one concept is then referred to in 2 different ways. So there's your pronoun antecedent agreement if you're more familiar with that expression. Okay, everybody good with, see, it's quick and easy. That's really all we have to say about that. Any questions about that part? We're going to do the we do, and then there's a you do, because we did just follow Anita Archer's presentation, and she would be very disappointed if we did not do I do, we do, you do. So questions before we go to we do? Okay. So let's work on this one together. Again, here's our strategy. As a reminder, we're going to look for the most important who or the what, the main topic of our very short segment of text. We're going to highlight that, and then we're going to draw lines to see what are the other ways that that main who or what is referenced within our short text. I'm going to give you just a moment here to read through our couple of sentences, 3 sentences. All right, and then try to identify what you think is the most important who or what in this passage. So as I'm reading this passage, I notice that it's talking about these living things. I see the word ecosystem a few times. I know that there are living things in ecosystems. So what do you think? What do you think my most important topic should be? You're all nervous. How about we take this cluster of words here from our first sentence? Because again, I have ecosystem a couple of times. I know there are living things in ecosystems. It's talking about these things surviving. It's talking about getting everything it needs in order to survive. So our most important thing, because we have a very specific ecosystem referenced in that first sentence, is that we have these living things in the shortgrass prairie ecosystem. So that's my main topic that I'm looking at. I see head nods, so some people agree with me at least. And now we're going to look forward and see, do they keep referring to that in the same way, or do they start to use different words to refer back to living things in the shortgrass prairie ecosystem? So let's go to the very next sentence. These species might not survive in a different ecosystem, a forest or swamp, for example. Is there something where I have to stop and say, what are they referring to? Oh yeah, they're referring to living things in the shortgrass prairie ecosystem. These, that's right. The first one that I have to look for, these species, we can take it together with that. So, but these in particular, sure. So I have to, at that point, stop and say, and the reason I put my arrow at species is really this cluster with these species, but species is a hard word. So I anticipate a lot of adolescents who would have difficulty with reading would stumble right there and go, well, now there's something new. First, I had to learn about shortgrass prairie ecosystems, and now we're talking about species. So what's this? So that's the point where I would have to say, okay, let's go back. What is that referring to? Because it's these species, not just any species. These tells me I have to go back. Okay, is there anything else in that sentence, or should we go to the next sentence? I see it. Okay, thank you. So in the next sentence, then what do I notice that might, where I have to stop and say, what are they talking about again? Oh yeah, living things. Each is the next one. Each what, right? If I have to stop and say each what, then I know I have to go back and look. What is it that we're talking about? Any others in that sentence? It. Oh, you guys are ace students. Everything it. What's the it? I have to go back. Living things. Okay. You all aced the we do, so you're ready for the you do. Easy breezy strategy, right? This is in a handout that's up on the website that is printed on the back of your ID card. Does the QR code take them to that same site to pull the? We're all going to test it right now. So you can either do it on your phone or enter it into your computer. For those of you that have your laptop up, it's not linked. The QR code is not linked. Oh, so we had the same session this morning and the 2 handouts were both there. If you log in and go under my schedule, then you can see the handout. Or all sessions? Okay.
Yeah.
Is anyone getting there? Session 11. There should be two handouts in there, one for this activity, the other one, if you see, it's on session 2, which was my morning one. Same session. So we'll just pretend we're all in session 2. You want the anaphoric reference one that should have these little short segments of text on there. And while you're finding it, let me just tell you why we're only using little short segments of text to work with. It's because we are trying to get students to be sensitized to this, to be aware that this is happening. So we're working with short segments of text as a way for them to realize what this is and how it works, so that as they're reading longer segments of text, when we ask them to stop and check their comprehension and make sure they're understanding, that if something is broken down, this is one of the things they can ask themselves within whatever portion they've just read. If I don't understand what's going on, let me try and see whether I've got this situation where the topic is being referred to with different words that I have to kind of put together, trace how it's being referred. Okay, are we all at the handout now? Not almost there. For those of you at the handout, pick one of the 3 that you want to practice with. So pick either something relevant to your content area, a content area you just love, and work with the people at your table to try our little quick and easy strategy where you're going to find the topic and then look forward and see, are there other ways that that topic is being referred to with different words. And I'm going to set my timer. They did it this morning in 2 minutes. I gave them 5 and they finished in 2. So we're going to try 2 minutes. That's the other handout. Yeah, that's the second activity. That's the second one, the second activity.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Did anyone do social studies? No social studies takers in here? That was the easiest one. Thank you. Yeah, girls and then they. How about the science text? Wetlands. They
Are.
areas. Okay. Here, let's make this easier. Yeah. The science text gets really tricky because we also have marshes, swamps, and bogs, which can be examples of our wetlands. So you see, I also have those underlined. So we add additional words that this is why we don't just call it pronoun antecedent agreement, because sometimes the other ways that we refer to it are not pronouns. So sometimes there are other examples that are new things. So I underline those just to kind of distinguish them. In the language arts one, we have the complexity of two different things that we can trace and connect in here. So we had Klaus, and then we have he and his, but we also had books, and then there's them. And so when we have two different things, this is a different kind of, so this was a certain kind of complexity, but this is a different kind of complexity where now I really do have to go back and figure out which one of them is them. Yeah, and because we don't in our language, in our common use anymore, we don't have strict numerical agreement with our pronouns, it can be even harder to figure out, is them referring to Klaus or is them referring to books? We can't rely on a numerical agreement system. So questions about that? Okay, that was the light and easy one. As we teach it, again, you want to use just short segments of text because the point is to raise awareness and to give some manageable practice for it. If you're trying to trace doing this with your class across a longer series of text, that can be useful and you can gradually increase to longer segments of text. It's just harder to manage as you try and track them all the way through. We also, again, just want this to become part of how students monitor their own comprehension, realize when they've gotten to a point where they say, now, which one was them? And how do they go back and figure that out and connect these pieces together? If we try to do every possible referent and relation, the passages would look like this. And that is just overwhelming. This is a 7th grade geography paragraph, just a paragraph from the section of text. And if you try this with middle school students, they will just say, well, no wonder I can't understand. What is the point? I can't ever figure this out. It's too much. So we just work with a little bit. We keep it manageable to give them the idea that this is something within your control, that if comprehension breaks down, try this as one of your fix-up strategies. It's not going to work all the time, but if you're ever at a point where you think, what was that? What are they talking about? You want to trace back and see. Okay, any other questions about that before we move to the meat of our time this afternoon? Yeah. That's okay.
For the first portion of like what is the new idea, what is the biggest idea?
Yeah.
There are students that struggle with that.
Oh, completely
So,
agree. Yeah. Yeah, so she's saying even when you start with what is the big idea, the most important, who or what, and how do we get them to do that? So we have found the same thing. And so we try to get them to look at, are there words that are repeated? So you will notice when I was doing I see ecosystem, it's number of times. I also know that this has to do with living things. What brings it all together? So we just kind of talk through what seems to keep getting repeated multiple times in there that we can't ignore it. If it's an explanation of something that's repeated often, that's a smaller detail of something. But if it's the main thing that in every sentence in some way, it's somehow referring to it, that's how we try to help them narrow it down. It's not going to work 100% of the time. But it's surprising how often it does work. I mean, I've pulled just passages from Common Lit and we've tried it and works pretty well. So, but those are also, they tend to be a little bit more controlled where they're intentionally repeating things. So they lend themselves well to trying that. Yeah. Any other questions? I spend more time on that when I do get the gist training. Okay, so syntax will play into fluency, and we're going to be using the word syntactical structures as I talk about fluency. But this is pushing fluency into new directions. Again, what we're talking about today with both of these ideas is new research, cutting edge research that hasn't yet made it into syntheses and meta-analyses because it's just now happening and information is emerging. So I want to start by acknowledging we have a funding agency for this, Institute of Education Sciences. They support it with money, but they don't necessarily stand by everything that I say today. I'm supposed to tell you that. This clicker, I can never tell if it's not hearing or if it's just going slowly. Okay, so the theoretical basis of fluency, how did we all get started working on fluency? It's very slow. Is there a reason why there's such a delay on it? Okay. So it all stems from verbal efficiency theory. Your working memory is a limited capacity storage system. And so if you can't get enough words into working memory before working memory starts kicking it out and trying to deal with some new thing, you can't get enough of them together at the same time in there, you can't make meaning. You're just struggling too hard to figure out individual words and can't put them together. Now, that implies that fluency only goes one way, that it only goes from fluency to comprehension. But in reality, your comprehension also drives some of what you do for fluency. So there is somewhat of a reciprocal relationship. But a lot of how this begins, because we have drawn from earlier studies with earlier readers, is through this idea of your limited working memory storage system and how that affects your comprehension. So that has meant, no, it might be faster if I stand over here and hit this thing. That has meant that all of the things that we associate with fluency have been kind of narrowly focused in what we've ended up doing in classrooms at times. So fluency really includes all 8 of these things. Are there any that you would like me to define for you? Good? Okay. Because there's a quiz question. So, see, you should have asked. No, so of all of these 8 things, which aspect or aspects of fluency do we most commonly measure? Okay. And that is a common answer to say pace, and this is why defining it will help you. So pace, when we refer to pace and fluency, what we really mean is your ability to modulate your pace based on what's happening with your reading. So for example, if I'm reading something really exciting, I tend to start reading faster because I'm on the edge of my seat and I'm getting to the next thing and it's really exciting, right? So you intentionally speed up and you modulate your pace. If I'm reading something that's either more difficult or perhaps it's more somber, I might go at a slower pace because that's appropriate for comprehension. So in this case, we're using pace to reference the way that you modulate your pace in order to either reflect your comprehension or support your comprehension. I think what you mean when you picked pace is about rate and accuracy, right? Yeah, right. And that is what we are really going to call effortlessness. And effortlessness is pretty much all that gets measured in school. Some people will also measure some sort of prosodic element, or they'll do an overall quality of the reading. But for the most part, when you're making decisions about student placement and intervention, when you're tracking their progress and judging their progress relative to a goal line, if any of this is sounding familiar to our RTI MTSS friends, you're really talking about effortlessness. So there's a whole lot of fluency that is being ignored in some sense, much to the chagrin of people who work in fluency like me. And it also is really indicative of how we kind of got started with this, which I will kind of walk you through here. So how did this become what was so important? Well, it had to do with the time period in which we started measuring fluency was when we did not have computer adaptive assessments. So we needed a time-efficient, cost-effective way to frequently monitor kids and tell if they were on track for grade level proficiency. And we needed to be able to start this when they were really little, even just with letter sound fluency. And then we would move maybe into syllables, syllable identification fluency, and then whole words. And then finally, about middle of first grade, we give them connected text. But the metric is rather consistent even when we change the unit. It's the unit per minute that they're reading correctly. So even if it's letters per minute that they read correctly. It could be syllables per minute, et cetera. So it's the unit changes, but the metric is rather consistent, which has sort of an elegance to it as students progress. We know that that metric is really indicative of comprehension and overall reading ability because it's been tested multiple times in my research, other people's research. We see it. It's a little bit less robust as kids get into about 5th grade and beyond, because unlike what the tests might suggest, kids don't just keep getting faster and faster and faster and faster forever. If that were true, we would all be reading really, really fast by now. But we don't. And there's a point at which we get sort of comfortable and we think, I may modulate my pace, but this is pretty much my comfort zone. So you level off, and that tends to happen around middle school. Statistically, we call it asymptote. When we plot the scores, it sort of levels off there. And it's still a good measure. It's just not as robust as it is in the earlier grades where growth is really rapid and it's a really strong indicator. Now, because that's how we measure it, you can follow this logically. Teachers want to help kids improve their scores on this progress monitoring instrument, so they start to teach it the same way it's tested, right? That's logical because they're trying to help kids improve their scores. But that meant that what we did was modeled after the way that we tested it. And the way we tested it was on effortlessness. So we taught effortlessness and we practiced for effortlessness. And we kind of neglected all of the 7 other things about fluency that would be really great and that propel comprehension in adolescence and beyond. Are you waiting to swap me out? This is it's very tired.
Brand new battery.
Thank you. It needs a rest. So how many of you are familiar with repeated reading? Most of you. For the uninitiated, we'll just walk you briefly through this and you'll understand why we need something else, especially if you're talking about middle school students. So in repeated reading, what happens is I put maybe 2 people together, partner 1 and partner 2, and I give you one passage. This one's Kayla and her puppy. And so if you and I are partners, you'll be partner 1, and we'll set the timer, and you will read as far as you can possibly read in Kayla and her puppy in 1 minute, but you won't get to the end. And I'll try to mark words that you're reading incorrectly, but I don't read very well, so good luck with that. And then the minute's up, and maybe I try and tell you the words you mispronounced, but again, I don't read very well, so we'll do our best. And then we'll go to my turn, and we're still on Kayla and her puppy, same passage. I'm going to start back at the beginning. We're going to set the timer for a minute. Thankfully, you're a better reader than I am, so you'll do a better job marking my words, and maybe you'll help me pronounce those, but I'm not going to finish the passage. I'm not a very good reader, so I'll be lucky to make it out of the first paragraph before my minute's up. And then it's back to your turn again, and you'll start at the beginning again, and we'll time you for a minute, and this goes on. So you're going to do it, I'm going to do it, you're going to do this. This one isn't any faster, so I talk faster than that. It's okay. We'll catch up. I think the connection is between the click and what's... Okay, that could be. Zoom is slowing us down today, but we'll be okay. So you get the idea. We try to read this passage 6 times, but we're never going to make it to the end of this passage. We're going to be so sick of Kayla and her puppy by passage reading 6, we're going to have memorized all of these words. So we're sailing through this passage, mostly because we're hoping the torture will be over if we just get it done. So we're going to be a lot faster here than we were up there. But if you give me a brand new passage, I'm not going to be reading this fast on the brand new passage, right? We're going to start back there again. I'm going to be reading more slowly. And then by the 6th time I've heard this Kaylin or puppy passage, I'm going to be reading pretty fast. So that's effective in terms of, I mean, it has been determined to be an evidence-based practice. So teachers have been doing it forever. It is associated with gradual improvements over time on oral reading fluency measures, which it emulates pretty closely, but it doesn't really transfer quite well to the kinds of complex texts that you're expected to read in content area classes, because the level that is selected for repeated reading practice is usually independent level text. Sometimes it's instructional level text, but it's usually very easy text. And largely because it's done by peers who are both having difficulty reading. So you can't give them really hard text. So it may be associated, there's lots of practice, it's still practice with reading. And you kind of get the idea of what it means to be a fluent reader by the end of the time with this, but it doesn't have long-lasting effects. So in addition to this, we see some potentially concerning evidence that this is being misused a little bit. So first of all, we've done reviews, my team's done reviews, others have done reviews that find that non-repetitive forms of reading practice are potentially just as good as repetitive reading. Repeated reading is considered evidence-based, but other things aren't necessarily not great. It does have this reduced emphasis on prosody and expression that are really integral to advancing comprehension as you get into more skilled reading. And we do have some anecdotal evidence of teachers doing unintentionally bad things. So for example, I was in an elementary classroom. The teacher was progress monitoring students with the oral reading fluency measure. And at the end of testing one student, she said, I know you're working so hard. You're reading, I don't know what it was, one more word correctly per minute than you were. So tonight, when you go home, I want you to read every page of your book 3 times. Thank you for that reaction. That was, I went, what, did I just hear that correctly? And so it's important for you to know, I always assume that teachers are doing what they think is the right thing. I don't think teachers are sitting there intentionally doing bad things. So I talked to her afterwards and said, tell me a little bit about that. Why did you tell him to read every page of his book 3 times tonight? She said, well, it's like repeated reading, and that's the only thing I know how to do for practice. So that's all he can do at home is read every page of his book 3 times. And for me, that was a real watershed moment where I realized we have got to figure this out because this can't go on like this. This is now counterproductive if this is happening. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, studying this, working on this. And then when you layer in what happens in middle school, if you've got students who are struggling with reading, they're not just struggling in their English language arts class, they're also struggling in any other class that is very text dependent, like science and social studies. So that's similar to what Dr. Bond was talking about this morning, that, if you could just work on reading across these content area classes, that would be really helpful and probably advance students even more. But your intervention time in middle school is extremely limited. So you're lucky to get some time carved out for a reading intervention. You're sure not going to get time carved out for science or social studies intervention, but they're probably also having difficulty with those classes. And in my state of Tennessee, we test science and social studies on the state exam every year. So kids are not doing well on those, but they're not getting intervention in those classes. So we're trying to find ways to leverage the intervention time that kids have to give them lots of practice that will not only advantage their reading, but also support them in their content areas. Unfortunately, we've done a deep dive into all the reading interventions out there for adolescents. And by and large, they feed students a pretty steady diet of very easy text. It does not emulate the kinds of complexity of text that they are expected to perform well with on state summative assessments, or just to get by in their English language arts, science, and social studies classes on a daily basis. It's too easy for that purpose. It serves other purposes, but it's not going to advance them to grade level skill. So I've also spent a lot of time working in universities that are big athletic schools. So you hear a lot about what they're doing to make athletes better. And there is some motor skill training practice that I thought, I'll bet I can take that and apply that to cognitive skills like fluency and reading. So I'm going to show you this little video clip where I went, I recognize that. I think I can do that with reading.
A traditional belief by many coaches is the mastery of a specific fundamental skill for their particular sport is achieved solely through the repetitive practice of that specific skill within a specific setting. The belief here is consistency will allow for the athlete to learn the skill and be able to perform the skill at an elevated level. What this philosophy fails to consider is the importance of being able to adapt to the environment provided from their sport and implement the skill in a variety of fashions. Very seldom can the conditions of an open skill be controlled within a game situation. Therefore, practicing a skill should occur with variability, a concept known as variable practice.
Variable practice is the practice schedule in which multiple variations of a given skill are practiced. Incorporating variable practice has been found to have a greater influence on performance and learning, allowing for the potential of the creation of a more skilled athlete. For example, in basketball, coaches often create shooting drills which have the players repetitively shoot baseline shots. To improve the athlete's shooting from this region of the court, implementing variable practice can be achieved by shooting from multiple locations to enhance the athlete's schema. Schema is the rule or relationship that influences and guides decision-making when the learner is presented with a problem. In doing so, the athlete is developing a variation of shooting from this region rather than from just one location.
While variable practice can be implemented to improve the potential of the athlete, the practice of contextual interference can provide beneficial results as well. Contextual interference is the interference that results from switching from one skill to another or changing the context in which a task is practiced from trial to trial.
By the time I got to contextual interference, I said that is actually reading language. Context is important. So we came up with the application of that to reading called varied practice reading that varies the semantic and syntactic contexts in which the words appear from passage to passage. So we pulled some of the concepts, we started before I was involved with this IES practice guide, but we connect to it because we have a form of repeated reading where we take the same words, but we mix them up from passage to passage. So you get that benefit of having repeated exposure to them, but the passages are different. And I'm going to show you what that means. It gives us the opportunity to focus on prosody instruction more and to talk about the quality of students reading, not just how fast they can read, but how well they're reading. And it gives us this chance to work with lots of different texts, which is desirable for contextual variation that you heard about in that little clip. So here's what we did. We wrote passage sets, and in each passage set, we have 4 passages. Across from passage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, we have an 85% unique word overlap. We eliminated in our word overlap count the function words. We don't count the or is. Those are too easy, even for middle school students who are struggling readers. We focus primarily on academic words, but that's with the loose definition of academic words, anything that's non-function. So we have some domain-specific words and lots of domain general words as well. So that's across the 4 passage sets. Our passage sets are equally divided between science topics and social studies topics that align to science and social studies standards for grades 6 through 8. They're also evenly divided between fictional genre and an informational focus. The fictional ones are still full of these academic words, so they're pretty information laden, but they do have dialogue and things that allow us to connect with the reading literature standards and not just the reading informational text standards. From the 30 passage sets, the first 10 passage sets in a given grade level are written 2 lexile bands below level. The next 10 are written 1 lexile band below grade level, and the last 10 are on grade level lexile. So we gradually stair-step kids up to the grade level expectation. Most reading interventions stay below. They start below, they stay below. They're too easy. So we stair-step ours up to on grade level text. And if you think that gets too hard for kids in intervention, I have a great story to tell you about one student that we worked with. She had a lot of difficulty. We were getting further in the passage sets, and I started cringing, thinking, oh no, this is just going to be painful today. We tried having her partner read first. We tried having her read first. We were trying everything so that she wouldn't give up. And then we had a passage that I knew was really hard. I was not looking forward to it that day. And she was the first reader that day. And she said, oh, it's about rocks. I love rocks. She read all of the words. We have igneous rocks in there. We have all of these hard words, everything that was difficult about rocks. She was the expert for the day. So we're also looking at text reader interactions as we go and asking kids about their background knowledge about these things so that we can see how that influences. But anytime a teacher tells me, no, those on grade level texts are going to be too hard, I bring up our example. We even have her recorded, so it's not just me making this up. We connect both to the content standards based on our topics, but all of the work that kids are doing in the reading intervention is connected to reading standards. So they have comprehension components that are connected to either reading literature or reading informational text. And we have a writing prompt that allows us to connect to everything related to writing standards. Here's an example when it comes up of how our words are distributed across a set of passages. And so you can see we have an 85% word overlap. So in some passages, it may mean that a word is not present, but overall, we have an 85% word overlap. And when we look at the actual, so these, we start with a list of the domain-specific words that come from the standards so that we connect to, in this case, the science standard on phases of the moon. But we also try to target domain general words within there that aren't specifically related to phases of the moon or to science. There are also other words that get into these passage sets. So let's see here. So this is what happens. These are what one of our passage sets would look like on phases of the moon. I only highlighted some of the word overlap because it might give you vertigo if we did every single word. But you can see if you just look at the bright pink highlight, for example, it moves around. You can't really anticipate where those words are going to be or in what sentences they will be used. You can't memorize. And that means we don't time kids because they have to get to the very end. Part of the word overlap may be based on a word that appears in the very last sentence. So if they don't get all the way through the passage, we haven't accomplished our multiple opportunities to practice these words. So they read the whole passage. If you're partner 1, you're going to read passage 1. If I'm partner 2, I read 2. You read 3, I read 4. So we took 6 boring readings of the same passage where you only get a little bit of the ways and made it into 4 full passage readings. And we never repeat the same passage, not one time. Nobody reads the same passage again. So we get all of the same benefits of the multiple exposures to the words, but pulling away from all the boring stuff of reading exactly the same thing and not being able to focus on prosody. Partners give each other qualitative feedback. Here's an example. I just pulled the sentences out of those 4 passages that had accomplishment in it, just so you can see. It's a lot of syntactic and semantic variation that we put into these sentences. So you really cannot anticipate it. After they do the partner reading, which is on a typical intervention schedule for middle school, that takes 1 class period. If you're on a block schedule, you can do all of it in 1 day, but most of our schools are not blocked. So they do partner reading 1 day and it alternates with the independent work. So the very next day after they finish the passage set, they're working by themselves. Everything is on the computer. And so they answer some text-dependent comprehension questions. They respond to a writing prompt where they have to pull textual evidence from all 4 passages to respond to the prompt. And then we have a bank of individualized lessons in 3 categories that teachers can assign to individual students. We give them a matrix for determining if the kid has a problem in this, which lessons should I assign, so that they're able to do that. This is a quick video that one of our undergraduate students who works with us made to encapsulate everything I just told you. So when we first did a randomized control trial in grade 4 using tier 1 classes, all kids, we did a head-to-head competition between varied practice reading and repeated reading, and varied practice reading statistically significantly outperformed repeated reading. Then when we looked at which kids benefited the most from it, it was the kids who were just below grade level, not the very lowest of the low readers, but that group between the lowest of the low readers and the on grade level readers, and the kids who were hovering around the proficiency cut point, so your bubble kids. So those 2 groups are the groups that benefited the most from from varied practice reading. So we talk about this as a tier 2 intervention, not tier 3. Those kids need much more intensive supports, and especially by middle school, they probably need a lot more decoding support. And your advanced kids don't need to be in intervention, so that's why it's tier 2. So in grade 7, and I'll show you our initial results in just a minute, but as we moved it up into middle school, again, here's how we align with the recommendations in the IES practice guide, but varied practice reading is not directly addressed in the IES practice guide, which was published in 22, because our research is still ongoing. We are doing our next randomized controlled trial with grades 6, 7, and 8 this next school year. So then we'll have additional evidence. But in our early results, these are effect sizes on standardized instruments, the old ITBS tests. You remember those? So standardized measures. This is pre to post growth. This was not from a randomized controlled trial. This is just the kids that were in the intervention, but that's a phenomenal effect size in science, even for pre to post growth for these kids. So it just goes to show you the 3 main things that we're concerned about. I mean, it targets this vocabulary, it ties in science and social studies, and on standardized tests, our kids showed really phenomenal improvement. So that was impressive enough to get us the funding to do this iterative development to create it for grades 6, 7, and 8. And we're up to the randomized control trial that we'll do next year, as I mentioned. But we have field tested it with all 3 grade levels. And this is the other thing I like to point out is kids in middle school, when they see reading intervention on their schedule, they're never, yay, I have reading intervention, right? So they don't like anything, but we ask them, how do you like varied practice reading? How do you like the passages? How do you like doing these things? Look at how high those percentages are for agreement for kids in reading intervention. That really blew me away. I was prepared to tell our funding agency, well, you know, these kids are in intervention. They really don't like anything. So, and then we got these results back and I went, oh, that's amazing. I never would have thought that they would have said that they liked BPR that much. So that was pretty exciting for us. You have a sample passage set up on the website. It's from the Mayan civilization. So it's a social, I showed you a science example here. That's a social studies one, so you get the contrast. It's also informational, and the one I showed you here was fictional. It had dialogue in it, which is one way that you can tell it was fictional. You can also see a sample of the multiple choice questions and the writing prompt that we have with them. Kids do not get these in PDFs like that. It's all on our digital platform, but that way you can see a sample and compare it to your experiences with repeated reading. Our next steps, we've been asked to do this for every single grade level, I think now, so we're really interested in expanding to additional grade levels. I have a big interest in looking at two-way immersion schools because I really think I could do 2 of the passages in Spanish and 2 in English and have it fit very nicely into 50-50 bilingual classes. So that's something I'm very interested in doing. We're also interested in adding AI for having a single reader option, so you don't have to have a partner, that kids could get feedback from the computer. Those are all future directions that they're not a part of our current study and won't be included in the randomized control trial. But just to let you know, this is why the science of reading is ever evolving, and it's a dynamic body of literature because we keep trying to press into these new areas. So if you don't have access to VPR right now, I'm just going to pull you back to the things that are in the IES practice guide that I would encourage you to look at in your own interventions to see, are you addressing these things? These are things we address in VPR, but if you don't have VPR, you can do it some other way. Just pay attention to them. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take some now in the minute or 2 that remain, and you can also email them to me. This QR code will take you to our website about our study for VPR.